feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck, alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
Today's show, we have the Bat, the Cat, and the Matt.
Oh yeah, today we are reviewing multiple Matts. Today we
Yes.
are reviewing Matt Reeves The Batman. Eric, one of our most anticipated movies of the year. It did appear on the official Untitled 22 of 2022. We're both huge Batman fans. You have a Batman tattoo. We've talked about Batman countless times as I think it is both of our, at least one of our favorite superheroes since we were kids. That and Spider-Man, even in our Spider-Man review and the lead up to No Way Home, we talked about the similarities between those two franchises and just how important those two characters are. We are now on our, I can't even, I lost count of how many different Batmen we've had and how many times it's been rebooted, but we are here again at the beginning, a new Batman franchise, and Matt Reeves is at the helm. It stars Robert Pattinson, Zoë Kravitz, Paul Dano, Jeffrey Wright, John Turturro, Peter Sarsgaard, Andy Serkis, Colin Farrell, and many, many more. Cinematography by Greg Fraser. It will be released on March the 4th. With early screenings, I believe I think even as early as March 1st in the US in IMAX, and then March 2nd here in Canada in IMAX. So people are going to be able to see it very, very soon. We saw an early screening, Eric. This will be completely spoiler free. I just want everyone, or as spoiler free as we possibly can. So anything that's shown up in trailers, light bits and pieces of the plot, but we're not going to give away anything huge that happened in the movie or anything like that. We will keep our thoughts brief, and then Eric and I will be back for a spoiler cast on the main feed where we go kind of in detail about everything that happened in the movie. So we're going to try to keep this, I say 20, 25 minutes. It'll probably go longer. Who am I kidding?
It'll probably be 3 days long. Let's just be real.
Because we got a lot to talk about, but this will be completely spoiler free. So I just want everyone to know.
Or should I say Real? Because the mayor's named Real.
And then Wednesday or Thursday, you'll find a spoiler cast on the main feed. Anyways, Eric, I'm going to toss it over to you, man. It's Batman. I don't know how much plot synopsis we have to give, but you go for it.
I mean, yeah, you could literally call this Batman Begins Again. And
sure,
this time around, you have Matt Reeves, who you've talked about recently on the regular show, having rewatched the Planet of the Apes trilogy from the 2000s, not the Tim Burton remake, but Rise, Dawn, and War, and two of those were directed by Matt Reeves, who's also directed films like Let Me In and Cloverfield, and is kind of known as, kind of like a little bit like J.J. Abrams, where he is sort of a company man, but also has an artistic flair and kind of brings his own style. When it was announced that he was going to helm the Batman, it kind of came at a time when the Zack Snyder verse was crumbling and Ben Affleck was still attached to star and potentially direct a version of the Batman, with him kind of doing almost like what he was describing a rogues gallery Arkham Asylum kind of movie where multiple villains would be shown throughout and kind of establishing the world that was already built. That never came to pass, and with Matt Reeves, his approach is leaning very heavily into the film noir canon of the 1930s and 40s, and specifically with the rain, the sort of dark undertones. Obviously, Batman is a darker character, so it kind of fits nicely. You have a voiceover narrative throughout that Robert Pattinson delivers in kind of an unaffected affectation that will, remind some people of even something like, Harrison Ford's voiceover in Blade Runner. Then you have, the Caped Crusader early in his days,
it's like
patrolling
year 2,
Gotham.
right?
Yeah, because they keep talking about you're introduced to him. He's kind of he's well known enough where criminals are fearing running into him on the city streets at night in corners and dark alleys and things like that. But at the same time, he also establishes that he can't be everywhere at once, and that, part of what makes the character such a symbol in this version is that he is striking fear in the hearts of all types of criminals, whether it be somebody, spray painting, a bank, or, stealing from a mini market or things like that. And then, more horrible stuff where, like, you have a gang that's in the trailer, sort of ambushing one person. Essentially what this movie is, though, is a kind of crime thriller puzzle box that has Batman pitted against the Riddler, played by Paul Dano, in solving his series of grisly sort of left puzzle pieces, which have corrupt cops and dirty DAs at the center, and this whole sort of mayoral candidacy kind of thing that's kind of into play. Again, trying to touch lightly on what the story is as a whole, but essentially what you have is Batman going from one sort of puzzle box or mystery to another, and unlocking certain aspects, while he's also introduced to multiple characters that you'll recognize from other Batman movies and other Batman comics, that is kind of building this new, more street-centric version of Batman, even less tech oriented than the Christopher Nolan films. I think it at times is even more grounded than Christopher Nolan's movies, but it does still have a little bit of that kind of, down and dirty kind of vibe to it. But instead of being, like the inspiration from Michael Mann movies, specifically like Heat, it is kind of, playing with movies like Chinatown and a lot of, like, even Double Indemnity and things like that, where, you have this character who's known as a
detective, yeah.
playing the role of detective. And also there's a commentary about anti-capitalism,
Yep.
and a social commentary on even where we are now. A lot of people will probably talk about sort of, the uprising in the US recently, and incels and all that, how
And
it
even
kind of
here in
factors
Canada
in.
with the occupation in Ottawa recently too, there's some of that in there. Yeah, man. I'll kick it off. I mean, we're in an interesting spot with Batman because we haven't had a solo Batman movie for what, almost a decade, right? We had,
Yeah,
you
Dark Knight
know,
Rises 2012, right?
yeah, wild. But sorry, I ate a third of a pizza before I started this, so I got.
But sadly it was not a calzone.
It was not a Little Caesars pizza, which, shout out, does appear in the movie. That's not a spoiler, but it's not as egregious as Uncharted, when there's not a whole set piece in a Little Caesars like Eric and I joked about. It's just on a billboard. But Little Caesars, confirmed, does exist in Gotham.
Now, do you think Matt Reeves, signed off on that because it is called Little Caesars, paying
Yes,
tribute
that's
to
exactly what I thought
Caesars?
too. Yeah, Caesar from Planet of the Apes. I really, really, really like this movie. After sleeping on it and thinking about it more, and you'll see in my voice and how I said that there. I'm not necessarily saying that I'm in love with it. And I don't want to come across as negative at all, because I just feel like after watching both of Matt Reeves' Apes movies recently, I just think both of those movies are near perfect in the, blockbuster adventure kind of genre, but each being their own kind of different thing. That I think this movie is very good, and I can't wait to see it again. But I do think that it is jam packed to the point of almost there being too much in the movie. Um, I There's here things to nitpick, but what I really, really loved about it was that it just felt like a really good arc of detective comics. And I feel like that's something, yeah, I mean, you put it perfectly, Eric, in your description, but like that's something that we haven't really gotten a lot of in the other Batman movies, or even in this show, like the 60s Batman show, which is completely different. But
Well, the 60s Batman show, I think, is actually the
yeah,
closest.
sure, but it's him more so just like, aha, and just like not really solving anything, rather than just saying he solved it and telling the audience what happened. But
Right.
that being said, I love detective comics. I like a more kind of grounded Batman story. I don't like Batman stories that get too crazy and involve some kind of the more superhuman element of the DC universe. I like
Nipples
when
on
it's kind of
suits.
uh yeah. So it was just kind of nice to see like a weirdly methodical and slower paced kind of Batman movie. And I don't know, I really liked it. I've been thinking about it a lot. I think the cast is phenomenal. Just for like quick thoughts, like I think Robert Pattinson is a great Batman. We don't get a lot of him as Bruce Wayne, but I kind of like his moody kind of, it's still pretty fresh in his head of what happened to his parents. I like they take the Spider-Man MCU route and just they talk about it, but they don't need to show you Martha and Thomas getting shot. I
Even
think
though they
Zoe
play a pivotal role in the
totally.
story.
Absolutely, which they always do, and they have to. I know we'll talk about this more, but I really like Paul Dano as the Riddler. It reminded me a lot of the Scott Snyder Detective Comics arc when Dick Grayson is Batman and James Gordon's son is a serial killer, and it's the same kind of style of glasses and just the way that arc plays out with James Jr. I think you can see that Matt Reeves took a little bit of that into this for this version of the Riddler. I thought each riddle was engaging, each murder was cool. It's weird to say a murder is cool, but like each way,
Murder is cool.
yeah. But like the way that, each, clue is set up and Batman trying to figure it out, I thought was really, really interesting. I thought Jeffrey Wright was a great commissioner, or he's not a commissioner, Captain Gordon in this. What would he be like? He's not a police
Sergeant
captain, sergeant
or
or something like that.
yeah.
Anyways, James Gordon, Jeffrey Wright is fantastic. I think it's something we both agreed on after the movie. John Turturro as Carmine Falcone is fantastic in, but probably when you're looking at everyone in this movie, like it is a more grounded, like street level Batman, like you're saying, but I felt like it still felt very comic booky. And I know those things like don't necessarily, they're like work together, but like it is over the top and it is very comic booky and it feels like it's leaping off of a page of like a modern gritty DC comic. So you get these kind of very, like flamboyant, but not in the, Schumacher way or even in the Nolan way. Like with the Riddler, he's a lot, like, and at times it's like wow, I did not think that this character would be this animated or things like that. And then
He's
same with
basically Jigsaw in this.
yes, which that's maybe why I like it, Eric. And then where someone like even Colin Farrell as the Penguin is very bombastic in a big presence as well, where Turturro is a little bit more subdued. But he's fantastic as well. And I just liked, the pacing of the movie is interesting because it's like, I think when people go into a Batman movie, we've just come to expect that it's going to be like filled with action. And this movie, don't get me wrong, has a lot of action and the action is exciting. But it is way more methodical and slower paced and focuses on the mystery and Batman working with Jim Gordon and Batman working with Catwoman, trying to figure this stuff out. That I thought was really, really interesting. And that's one thing I've liked about, keeping these Batman movies fresh, is that like each filmmaker who comes in, I feel like for better or for worse, puts their stamp on the character, and each version of Batman has felt completely different. Like I think the Keaton Batman, even Returns to Batman 89, feels completely different to an extent. Even though it still feels very, Tim Burton and in that world. It gets a little bit more flamboyant and comic booky in that second one, even as
I
well.
would say
And
that
then,
that is the most comic booky in
totally,
terms
I
of
agree.
that original collection. Like the Schumacher movies are very
They're
flamboyant and over the
cartoony, I
top.
would say, not comic booky.
But
The Schumacher ones.
but Batman Returns, I think, is even more Tim Burton specific than Batman 89.
Yeah.
Like Batman 89 has its elements where it's like, oh, okay, like he's using animation in an interesting way. It is gothic at times, but it feels like Batman Returns was the movie where he kind of jumped off and did truly his own thing to the point
Oh,
where it
totally. Yeah.
alienated a lot of
Oh,
people.
and that, don't get me wrong. And that's why I think each iteration of Batman has been so interesting. Like the Schumacher Batmans aren't good, but they're fascinating to look at as kids movies and live action cartoons. And then you go into the Nolan trilogy, and I feel like this will bring a lot of comparisons to the Nolan movies, obviously, because they're both trying to do the more grounded kind of, adult Batman kind of story. And I feel like that's not necessarily fair to this movie, because I feel like they each can live on their own, and it is kind of comparing apples to oranges, even though it's the same character. Like, I feel like they are doing completely different things, in my opinion, where I do think that there's nothing in this movie that I think hits the highs of some of like each Nolan movie. Like, there's just a scale that Chris Nolan has that I feel like is unmatched, that Matt Reeves isn't necessarily trying to even hit, because again, he's trying to do something completely different. But I think that this is a wonderful setup with tons of fantastic world building. Um, and I just can't wait to see where it goes next. Like, and I can't wait to see it again. So I think that's very telling. But Eric, I'll let you go because we'll get more into it. But those are my kind of quick thoughts on the movie.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same bat cave as you when it comes to, I don't even want to say enjoyed it, because it's not that's another thing
It's
where
not
I
a
think,
fun movie, but
no,
like
I
in
think
a
that is going to be something similar to Batman Returns, where you're going to get a lot of people going into this thinking they're going to get, pure entertainment, and they're going to be sitting there for nearly 3 hours watching this densely constructed, almost a season's worth of plot
yeah.
within this sort of detective tale going on. And I think that is the flaw of the movie, because it's so ambitious for what it is taking on, and you can appreciate that from, even like, I don't know if Matt Reeves is a video game guy, but we've been talking a lot about this as well recently with Uncharted and even Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. Like, this does almost feel like you could easily adapt this narrative as a Batman video game, like the way that, like, there are certain aspects of, Batman decrypting certain clues that are left, or riddles that are left, and
The
how he
Arkham
does
games are
them.
very much like this. The Arkham Batman games that came out a few years ago
Yeah,
have these kind of detective moments.
and that's where I think, like, it's strongest, but it also, the weakness of that is that there are so many moving parts in the script by Matt Reeves and Peter Craig, who Peter Craig adapted Ben Affleck's The Town. That it's like, okay, well, we have to, take this component that we've, focused on, the stuff with, John Turturro's Carmine Falcone, and we have to put that to aside for a little bit. Then we have all this stuff with, Zoe Kravitz's Catwoman, that we have to kind of develop for a little bit there, with the police procedural element, and sort of like her becoming his eyes and
Mhm.
ears to the criminal underworld, which kind of also reminded me a little bit in one sequence in this movie, of a scene in No Time to Die, with how that kind of plays out a little bit with how audio is used specifically.
Yeah.
Um, and then it's like, okay, well, then we're going to move that, to the side a little bit, and then we're going to also have this stuff with, this mayoral campaign that's going on, and, again, we're going to move that to the side, and then all the stuff with, Bruce and Alfred being played by Andy Serkis, who,
Caesar himself.
yes, and I think that relationship is one of the more interesting components here, because unlike previous versions, there's always Michael Goth and Michael Caine. There was always a warmth to them, even though they were still stern, sort of parental figures in Bruce's life. But here you get a sense that the last couple of years there has been quite a bit of friction between both Alfred and Bruce, and that kind of wears nicely on Andy Serkis, and how he kind of, conveys a reluctance in sort of going along with this, more than the Alfreds before, who kind of almost are just there to, stitch him up, or, make sure he eats every now and then, where, like, you see this version of Alfred kind of like basically saying, you know okay, there's enough here to intrigue me to keep going along, but you gotta, pop your head out every once in a while, like you're tarnishing, the
Yeah.
the Wayne
The
name.
Bruce
And
Wayne side of things. Yeah.
yeah, and so that I think is fascinating. But if this
You don't get a lot of that though.
No, you don't, but the stuff when you do, it is
It's
interesting.
good.
And
Yeah.
again, it sometimes gets kind of shuffled around when you're having all these mechanics in the script kind of going back and forth to certain things and unlocking certain plot revelations that will then sort of lead into the next thing, which also is again very video game-esque, where it's like, okay, you need this key in order to unlock this door, and once they find it, they go back to it. And it's even the characters, the way that they come in and out of the film, it is Batman's story for the most part, but when you're kind of getting used to a subplot that you like, it's then again sort of tucked away to the side for a little bit. And with being 3 hours long, you do feel it. Like this, like the Nolan movies, especially The Dark Knight, move at a pace where the set pieces complement a lot of the verbose dialogue and a lot of kind of the classic world building that you need to accompany these movies, where Matt Reeves the Batman has, as you mentioned, a lot of really wonderful sort of thought out practical in-camera effects and action sequences and set pieces, but there's nothing that necessarily stands out the way that like a truck flipping in the middle of Gotham does in The Dark Knight, or even it's been criticized, but like you do remember in Batman Begins with the final kind of monorail train sequence as well, or
Even the training sequence with Ra's al Ghul and stuff like
yeah,
that too.
or the opening sequence in The Dark Knight Rises with Bane. Like those scenes kind of stick out when you're talking about that. With this, there's not one kind of moment that kind of feels defined by like, oh, okay, like this is a great scene that will kind of like be the one that people remember in this movie. The thing that people are going to remember is that it's bogged down in procedural elements, in that again, it's Batman brooding his way through this case and kind of
It is the most emo Batman we've gotten.
yeah,
That's for
uncovering the
sure.
truth. I mean, Matt Reeves has said that he's kind of
Yeah.
based this Batman on Kurt Cobain, which that is also an interesting thing, because you have Michael Giacchino composing the score, and the score is essentially three pieces that are recycled over and over again: the Batman theme, Catwoman's theme,
And
Riddler's theme. And
yeah.
then you have Something in the Way by Nirvana, which has been kind of again
In the
sort of
trailers and
altered a little bit to kind of make it
Mhm.
more slower and kind of moody and melancholy and kind of fit in tone. And then you also have Ava Maria as well, and those are the songs that consistently just rotate. It's almost like somebody like a teenager, like the first time discovering Nirvana, but also kind of like creating a mixtape, and like their five favorite songs are these songs, and listening to them
they're
in
different
rotation over
arrangements,
and
because I
yeah.
did listen to the score today, and I think the score is phenomenal. But like,
It is, but
it's not as
it's
varied
repetition.
as the Apes movies scores, or something like that. If I'm comparing, Reeves and Giacchino
Yeah, but what I'm trying
collabs.
to say with it is that you remember them because there's
Mhm.
so much
Yes.
repetition.
And I like that though. Like I like when a character kind of has a theme in a movie. Like, and I feel like, I couldn't tell you what the Nolan Batman theme is. Like I know the Zimmer score is great, and I know the dun dun, dun like the
Well,
yeah,
also
I know
the
it dun. Well, yeah,
and
the Blom comes from that, but like, and I can picture or in my head, I can't do it because I'm not musically inclined at all. But like, I know the Dark Knight theme or the Batman Begins one, like that Nolan Batman theme. But like,
or
uh,
Bane's kind of the chant, right? The
yeah,
rising
yeah,
chant, which
yeah,
is
yeah.
the vocalization.
And Hans Zimmer's score is incredible. I think Giacchino here really created some fantastic themes that are all unique. Like you said, with the Batman theme, which you've heard in the trailers, they've released the jazzy kind of Catwoman piece of music, and even the Riddler one that's a little bit even more bombastic than I was expecting from that. But yeah, I'll echo everything that you were saying, and I mean, it goes back to what I was saying. Like, this movie is almost overstuffed, but I feel like is so meticulous in the way that it's plotted out that it does ultimately work. Um, but I did feel the length as well, and I mean that in not a totally negative way, because I was enjoying myself all the way through. It's just I went, "Whew, this movie, there's a lot in here." And I remember keep thinking that over and over again of being like, yeah, you got the Riddler is the main villain, but then you introduce Catwoman and how she's involved in this kind of in everything, and then you have James Gordon who already has a relationship with Batman, and then you got the crime syndicates with Carmine Falcone, and then you're like, okay, and then Oswald Cobblepot and the Penguin is his second hand man. Then you got the mayoral stuff going on, and then you're like, and everything does ultimately come together at the end. And I think that's why this movie will benefit from like a second watch, because I feel like it was almost overwhelming watching it, to the point where like I did ultimately like the sum of all of its pieces, but like when watching it I was just like kind of like, yeah, like at times. And then going back to the comparisons with the Nolan movies, we were talking a little bit about this, where like if you're comparing Begins to this, which I guess is a fair comparison, um, I think that this is. I'm really intrigued to see that Matt Reeves, if he is going to do a full trilogy, which I hope he is, being able to kind of plant the seeds early, much like Nolan did in his movies. And I remember even seeing Batman Begins for the first time and being like, oh, that was good, and not caring that much, and then going back to watch Begins after the trilogy was over and liking Begins even more. I think we both said that we like this probably a little bit more than Begins, but like, um again, going back, it's just to the singular moments is like, yeah, there's uh you think the car chase, which you've seen in the trailers, I think the last act, there's a really good Batman sequence, without saying anything about the last act, that I think is quintessential kind of like Batman. And I like that he's a little rough around the edges and that he's emo, and I think he still does have the gadgets and everything, that like it's not as much as you were like saying, but I like the use of them, and they felt like something someone would have just like cobbled together. And he
Yeah,
is
there's no
brutal
Lucius
and like,
Fox in this
no,
scenario.
and he is a brutal Batman, and I like the voiceover, and I like how I love the look of Gotham in the movie as well. Like each Batman series has its own look for Gotham as well, and I think this was a good middle ground between the Nolan Gotham, which was just like clearly like Chicago, and the Burton um not maybe as, wild as Burton's
Well,
Gotham,
Burton's
but like,
and this were both shot in the UK, because
yeah.
Batman
And
'89 was shot in the UK for the most part. So
but did you see any of that? Because like I saw in the establishing shots in Gotham with the neon, and you got a lot of New York, like Gotham Square Garden is clearly Madison Square Garden and things like that. And Gotham was always very New Yorky.
yeah,
But like I got a lot of like even Burton's, like just the big cathedral style buildings with these like kind of bright billboards and things like that. Like
it's more heavy on the set
yeah.
design. Like it like
Yes.
Burton's stuff has always been like a combination of animation and set design that kind of was a big kind of aspect of it. Like it does feel like most of, like, it was shot in the UK, but a lot of it does feel like it was shot on sound stages compared to Matt Reeves' one, where like you can see that they were shooting more on location and outdoors, and on, and
I
that's
just love the
probably
vibe
why.
of Gotham in this movie. Like
Yeah,
it's
well,
very
it's
like,
more tactile than
yeah.
previous versions, and yeah, like it kind of feels more of, again, a connective tissue to the story that's being told. And I think kind of the detective story works well with the criminal that Batman is sort of investigating and
Yeah,
tracking
we should talk
down.
about that. Yeah, the Riddler being the
But
main
I will
villain.
say this: I did not like Paul Dano's Riddler. And Paul
I
Dano's an
know.
interesting guy where I I like him, but he has this tendency when he plays this type of character to go over the top in a manner that can be a little bit grating and also obnoxious. He even did this with the one scene that he's in, which was one of his first movies, which he also played a serial killer. Spoiler alert for Taking Lives. He played the younger version of Ethan Hawke in the opening sequence of that movie, and like he kind of gave away, who he was playing in that one scene, but also kind of stuck out like a sore thumb because he was so just a little bit too intense. And I get that he's playing this unhinged serial killer incel-esque kind of guy, but it's just like with a lot of serial killer movies, I feel the more over the top they are, it kind of takes away from the whole point of what a serial killer is. Because you look at, Kevin Spacey in Seven, which that's obviously a movie it's influenced by, or even, not John Carroll Lynch, but the voice actor who did the Zodiac Killer, when he's calling in to talk to Brian Cox on the phone. Or, you talked about Dexter on the regular show recently. There's a ton of serial killer movies and TV shows where it's like, okay, we got to have these guys at 12. And because they've got to be creepy and weird and disturbing, and we got to get that point across. In a lot of cases, serial killers are boring and unassuming and just kind of plain. And those are the ones that are the scariest, because they're just like, oh, you would have never expected this person because they're non-existent. And part of the Riddler is that he feels like he's just completely invisible, but he's so bombastic and over the top that it's like, again, I know it's a Batman movie and not,
That's what
Henry
yeah.
Portrait based on a serial killer or something like that. But I
Yeah.
look at a movie like The Vanishing. The serial killer in that movie is just this regular guy, and it makes it so unnerving that it's like, why is he doing this? He seems like, just like, he's a family man, and he's just,
Right.
and like, it's just like Paul Dano's performance is always at 12. Like, it's
I know,
never,
yeah.
and again, there's a lot of understated performances in this movie. You mentioned, John
Turturro.
Turturro, who is amazing in this movie, who can also be very over the top. Like, he's incredibly, articulate and just energetic in something like the Coen Brothers Miller's Crossing, where it's so understated and underplayed. Zoe Kravitz, and Jeffrey Wright are both just giving these performances that are more naturalistic than we've seen, I think, in other,
For
interpretations of these
Catwoman and
characters.
Gordon, yeah.
Yeah. And so with Riddler, I understand that, like, okay, we're trying to make him a little bit like the Joker as well, where, like, this is a madman who's taking over the city, and, also inspiring amount of fear and vengeance in the hearts of people, and kind of, pulling what the Batman is doing and kind of making it the more kind of evil version of it. But there's just something about that performance and sort of how serial killers are handled in general in blockbusters and action movies and this kind of realm that rings false a little bit. And again, I like Paul Dano. I think Paul Dano can be really good in movies like Little Miss Sunshine. He's really great in Okja, um which weirdly he's understated in that movie, where everybody else is over the top in that film. But I look at this, I look at Prisoners, I look at a lot of the stuff where, like, he's required to kind of go to that pitch of 11,
Yeah.
12, and it kind of takes me out of the film. And that was the thing that kind of grated me the most with it, even though I understand why they're doing it and the mechanics of it. And again, it is a comic book adaptation,
Yeah,
but
that's
also, but saying that, I think it's fair to criticize it for that, because it's also trying to be a movie that's not just a comic book film. It's trying to play within the film noir style. It's also trying to be a grounded gangster movie. It's doing all these things. So I think it is fair game to look at it that way, the same way that Joker, the Todd Phillips, Joaquin Phoenix film, is also trying to be a Martin Scorsese movie, and criticize it not just as a comic book movie, but also as a film that's trying to emulate these other movies in the past. What it also does in a very rudimentary way, even though there is a lot of plot, it's not as convoluted as, say, The Big Sleep or Chinatown, or even Inherent Vice with its plot. It's pretty easy to follow. It's just there's a lot of it.
going on. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I hear you. I definitely understand where you're coming from. I'm kind of on the complete opposite side of where you are. I loved Paul Dano. I loved how over the top he was. To me, it went back to my point of this movie, and one reason why I really dug it is because I felt like it embraced those comic book elements. And like I get what you're saying about serial killers and things like that, but then I leaned more on it's a comic book movie and the Riddler is a flamboyant over the top character. And yes, they wanted to bring him down a little bit and make him more street level like we're talking about. His costume is bought at, army surplus stores and like everything he could have found and done himself. But
It's
I
kind of
like that
cobbled
he's still
together.
yes, and I loved the look of it. I loved how kind of over the top it was at times because that is the Riddler to me. And then that's why one thing why I think this movie is very interesting is because it is a grounded noir, methodically paced, slow burn Batman movie. But then I do really feel like it embraces some of those comic book elements and tries to mash those things together. And maybe it's not going to work for everyone, but for me, I liked the mashing of those two worlds, like to try to make that hard-nosed detective story, but then still be very comic booky. Like to me, Dano's Riddler like was something I'd see in a Scott Snyder, Riddler story in the Batman comics of the last 10 years, right? Like where you're trying to be a little bit more adult, you're adding a lot of violence, but the crux of that character it always was a dude in a bright green suit with a question mark cane and going, riddle me this, Batman. And like, to me, I think it's really cool to take those flamboyant elements and still have them in this very disturbed, character and have it be so like no one could put together the ciphers and the fucking jigsaw saw traps he puts together in this movie and like things like that. It's all ridiculous. But then like I just kind of embrace its goofiness, but then feel like does it work in this world? And I go, yeah, I think it does work in this world. A dude's dressing up like a bat. He's running around. There's, the way that the final act plays out, I think is like, it's very comic booky and over the top while still trying to maintain that kind of grounded street level feel. And I think that's something that's so difficult to do and ballsy to try to do. And I know like, Nolan's movies, I feel like you go back and like everyone's like, wow, it's so grounded. But I'm like the Two-Face stuff, even the Bane stuff, like there's a lot in there that is also very comic booky and over the top. And I just feel like this movie just did a really good job with that as well. And I don't know, there's some moments with Dano. I love the look of the character. Like I said, I liked each riddle that he put together. And like I liked this take on that flamboyant character because ultimately he, like you said, he wants to be seen, and someone who went his whole life, not being noticed. Why wouldn't you go to fucking 12 to be like, notice me? And like, that's what I kind of liked about it. That each time, like whether every phone call and every riddle, it was so elaborate and so big. And then even in the, like, as it kind of keeps escalating and escalating, like, um, I think there's a really fucking awesome moment in the like, and it's very, again, it's derivative of these movies you talked about, of serial killer movies, of noir movies, of like Zodiac, of all the of Seven, all this stuff. But like, I just think seeing that in a Batman movie was really, really cool. And like, there's a moment with the opening kind of murder from the Riddler. I just
Which
goes
you've
back to
seen
some
in
of
the
the
trailer. This isn't a spoiler either.
no, 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 no. You've seen a bit of it. I won't go into details and I won't even say what the shot is that I really liked, but it was just like it's very I don't know, like I just loved the vibe of the whole movie and it just kicks off in such a way where I'm like, "Oh fuck, I'm in. This guy looks fucking cool and like I just love this take on the Riddler." And like I totally see where you're coming from too, Eric. Like I get that and I think there will be people on either side of this cuz like um I think some people will go, "Oh no, Reeves wanted this grounded, thing," and then you add this character that at times is way over the top.
And I think he's over designed a little bit too. Like I know you like the look of him, but like even to
Mhm.
the point of like the heavy breathing. Like it's like
Yeah, I loved it.
okay,
I loved it.
like this
I loved it.
signature this
I
signature
loved
of a
it.
character who breathes heavy and has, a voice modulator and, does the saw, the John Kramer kind of thing. Like I get it. You're wanting to do something different compared to the Frank Gorshin Riddler, or
And
Jim
Jim
Carrey's
Carrey,
Riddler, or
or
John
even the
Astin, who is also
classic
on.
Riddler from the comics too.
And I like Frank Gorshin's Riddler and John Astin's Riddler from the
yeah,
Batman
for
TV
sure.
series. And I understand where you're saying, it's this guy who's literally giving riddles, but it's like, again, it almost does feel like Matt Reeves is trying to have his cake and eat it too, where it's like, I want to make this serious, down to earth, realistic, grown-up movie, and it is based on a comic book, but I can take that and show you that these movies can also be for grown-ups, but I'm still going to have this character who is literally designed by the last, like, sort of breath of his life, and kind of feels almost too wacky even for the comic books. And like I look at someone like John Turturro. I could take him out of this movie and I could put him in Donnie Brasco, or I could put him in.
But that's not what I want in a Batman.
No. I know
Riddler.
that. But you can take that character and put him in another film.
Sure.
You take this Riddler, you can't put him anywhere else other than a Jigsaw movie.
But that's why I love him.
But I feel like the movie itself is thinking that this is like the most authentic and cool and creepy version of a character, and it's so unsettling and it's so scary, and by the time you get to the end of the film, I was so annoyed with him. I was just I love the escalation. He's so predictable. He's so, like, I was almost like Brad Pitt in Seven when, like, he's berating Spacey in the back of the car. It's like, you're just a fucking caricature. And it's not just this movie, though. I shouldn't say that. Like, it's the way that serial killers are usually portrayed in these kinds of films, where it's just,
and I don't disagree with you. I'm just okay with it in a Batman movie.
No, and I get it, but the Batman movie that it's in is also trying to be something that is geared towards grown-ups. And it's like, on one hand, it's like, okay, be this mature, movie that wants to kind of be made for, people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and like, even sort of, bring over or convert the skepticals. But then you have the Paul Dano stuff, and then you have Colin Farrell imitating Robert De Niro,
and he's also
in a fat
over
suit,
the top,
and over the top. But there are also caricatures like that you could, criticize and be like, okay, well, like, what makes him any more different to, say, like Joe Pesci's character in Goodfellas? And there are people that are like that, but it's this weird kind of stereotype of, like,
Eric just has to stick up for all those serial killers. They're not being represented properly.
I'm just saying it's just so lame.
I'm kidding.
Again, I'm coming from a point of view of, my father was a forensics investigator, and a lot of these people that do these horrible things are people that you like. Even the way they do them,
I get that.
It's done in a way where it's like, it almost, to me, feels like it's weirdly, like,
but people also don't dress up like a bat. That's
no,
I
know,
I
know,
so that's why I'm like, I don't care.
But when it is trying to be like, okay, like, this is a story about,
where I don't, that's where
government
I kind of
systematic corruption.
Sure.
Which is about, like, institutional racism.
That stuff
and
is real, but you can talk about that in a comic book movie.
And we'll talk about that more in the spoiler. But when it's having that in there, and it's like, okay, well, like, this movie is going to mean something. It's going to be about what's, going on right now in the world. It's going to be a social commentary and reflect those things. And then on top of that,
you think it undercuts it when the guy's so over the top. I get what you're saying. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I disagree with you, but like, I
don't dislike the movie either. I know you don't. The
so I don't want to end
stuff,
on that either,
and I like, Greg Fraser's cinematography, and
I will say about the cinematography, there's nothing like in the last. Again, I keep going back to the Apes movies, like, the shot in Dawn on the tank spinning around, or like the one shot of Jason Clarke running through the thing. Like, I never felt like that. It's gorgeous throughout. Like, I think it's just consistently very, very solid, but I think going back to those wow moments, or those giddy moments that you get either in the Nolan movies or I got in his Apes movies, I never had one of those moments, even though it's consistently very beautiful. Does that make sense?
Or even the one sort of car sequence in Let Me In. Like, again, I'm going to go back to the serial killer thing for a second. I look at someone like Richard Jenkins in that movie and how
Yeah.
he's written, very similar, even the way that he kind of creates a
Has the
makeshift
bag and yeah.
costume. He's doing it out of partly necessity, but again, like, it kind of feels like Matt Reeves knows what he's doing, and I wish that he kind of applied that to that. Or maybe it's just Dano. I don't know, because Dano can be so, like, even in something like Prisoners, he can be so grating at times. And I find, like, when directors ask him to kind of like go to that extra level, it's just too much.
When he goes
And
double Dano.
yeah, and again, some characters it's appropriate for, and
Sure.
you expect it of, but when it is trying to kind of be taken seriously as a movie and not just a comic book adaptation or a
Hmm.
superhero movie, which it wants to be both, I think it has to be open to those criticisms. And
Fair.
I think that it has, like, again, there's a lot here to like. There's a lot here to kind of uh dissect when it comes to the making of the film, when it comes to the look, when it comes to the writing, the performances and everything. But I think there are things in this, the Batman, that aren't as great as I was hoping they would be, and maybe it's an expectation thing. And I think it's with that, with the Apes films, because there was very low expectations
Sure.
with those ape
Again,
movies
not
after
apples to
Tim
apples.
Burton's.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more like bananas and plantains or something like that,
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
savory versus sweet. But I think going into the Planet of the Apes movies, after that Tim Burton remake, there was nobody that was like, oh, like, I'm really
I
jonesing
really
for
need
this.
more of this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then Rise was such a surprise, which was directed by Rupert Wyatt. And then when Reeves came in, it was kind of like, oh, that was, that one movie was a pleasant surprise. I don't know if I need another one, but hey, I mean, Matt Reeves is kind of coming on, and he,
And then
you
you're like,
know,
holy shit. This
yeah, and so with this, you're going into it
in
thinking,
with
oh,
high
it's Matt
expectations.
Reeves
Yeah.
directing, a Batman
Absolutely.
movie.
And I think that absolutely plays a part of it. And then that's why I'm excited to kind of revisit this movie in a week when we go see it again. Because, like, these are our initial impressions. And I was saying this, to you earlier, where it's like hype builds. And no matter if you're a film critic or you're just a fan or anyone, like, hype gets behind things. Like, we love movies more than anyone. So we are going to be excited for a movie. And that's going to come into play when you see a movie. And I feel like that affects your opinion sometimes, even if you want to objectively look at a movie of the good or bad. That's not usually how I review a movie. I like to go from the subjective thing. And if you agree, if you go, oh, I agree with Matt a lot, that's how, that's why I want people to listen to us. But, like, I really feel like hype does play a part into these movies, and I am very excited. I always find myself, especially at TIFF and big movies like this, like, I love seeing it a second time with tempered expectations. You know exactly what's going to happen in the movie, so you can kind of just, like, the second time, just let it wash over you, and, like, and just pick out different things or analyze scenes or characters that at the first time it was just so overwhelming, or you're so excited for what's going to come, and, like, that you just, yeah, when you don't know what to expect, it kind of plays a huge part into it. So, like, I'm very excited to rewatch this, especially because what we said, it's a detective story. It is a puzzle box. Like, I want to go back to the beginning and, like, when everything, and see it from the very beginning and see the seeds being planted and what the Riddler's ultimate plan was. And, like, I'm very excited to watch it again. And, like, so quickly before we wrap up, I don't know what else we need to touch on. Like, the action, I think, is exciting. I just think it comes in very quick bursts, and, like, the choreography is really cool. Like, this version of Batman is very brutal, and I like that he's not just, like, perfect, but he is obviously very skilled, and, like, he'll just walk in brazenly into, like, a nightclub and just try to beat the fuck out of everyone, which I think is really really cool. And there's so many moments where, instead of sneaking through the shadows, Batman just walks up and he's like, I want to talk to the Penguin. And you're like, okay. And,
Yeah.
like, I like seeing the Iceberg Lounge, and, like, the world building, I think, is so cool. And I think that's why having so many villains in the movie, with Penguin playing, a smaller role, and Catwoman playing an integral role, but and then having Falcone play an integral role, but, like, these are all individual kind of Batman villains, but um we said it at times feels a bit overstuffed, but like I feel like I said, it kind of comes together in a really nice way. And I think Robert Pattinson, like we didn't talk a lot about, like him as Batman, but I think when he was cast, I think a lot of people who don't, watch some of his indie stuff after Twilight were like, oh, the Twilight guy is playing Bruce Wayne and Batman. But I think he does. He's got a great chin for it. I like his bat voice. Like, I think this brooding version of Bruce Wayne and Batman, even though each one is brooding in its own way, but like his Bruce Wayne is really interesting, and we really only get one sequence when he is Bruce Wayne in public. The other times it's just him like after he's in from a night of fighting crime or trying to solve this mystery, that he's just like broken and just analyzing things, and like and I just you don't get a lot of Bruce Wayne in the movie because it is very much a Batman detective story first. But I'm excited moving forward to see how Reeves, knowing what he did with those two Apes movies and like the world building and advancing Caesar's story and just it coming full circle, like, and the place that he leaves this movie in, I think is really interesting. And like and we'll get more into that in the spoiler talk, but I think there's a lot there. There's a lot to like. I totally understand where you're coming from on the Riddler standpoint, although I really liked it. But I'm not even like, again, the movie's not without its faults. Like, again, I think that at times there is a lot in there. It is, you do feel the length a bit. I think for some people who are looking for like, an action blockbuster, start of the summer kind of movie, it's not necessarily that. But I think if
No.
you're like a hardcore Batman fan and you like the detective comics, which is where Batman, debuted, I think you're really going to vibe with this, and I think you won't be disappointed. And like, it goes back to, I think there's valuable stuff in each version of Batman.
Well, even the Schumacher movies, like I think
Yeah.
with those films, they're boring to bad,
Yeah.
but I think it's just interesting to see how far they went in kind of a
The opposite
more
direction.
commercial, kid-friendly version after Batman Returns was so subversive to what audiences were expecting the franchise to be, and also how it was kind of dictated by merchandise at that time, because they were selling McDonald's toys and action figures and things like that, and you can't have a dirty looking penguin in a onesie bleeding out black goo to children. And so they're like, okay, well, we need to kind of completely revamp the tone of it. And those two movies, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, nearly killed the superhero franchise completely. And so like, that's even just interesting to see, like, okay, well, that is truly like the lowest mark where Batman movies can go, for the most part. And it even tarnished everybody's like, even someone like Joel Schumacher, who has since passed away. I always looked at him as the guy who ruined Batman for the longest time as a kid. And then you go back and watch The Lost Boys or Falling Down with Michael Douglas, or
He's a good
even with
director.
Tigerland with Colin Farrell, which was
Yeah.
his big breakout movie, and think like, oh no, he did do some good work that also influenced a lot of other people in some way or another. It's just that, like, he was just a studio guy, and for one thing or another, it didn't work out, even though he liked Batman, and he actually apologizes on the audio commentaries for Batman Forever and Batman and Robin for ruining the character.
Nah, you
So
know what? They were kids movies. They were
no,
cartoons.
no,
Like
and
at
he
the
knows that,
like,
but he still
yeah,
apologizes, and it's
I get
funny.
that.
Like, but yeah, like, so it's just fascinating to see a character that's had what, like 80 years of
Yeah.
of, but also I think maybe part of it as well, even though we haven't had a solo Bat movie in 10 years. I think I would like this movie more if there was a little bit more time
Because we
between,
still had all the Affleck Snyderverse stuff, right?
yeah, there, as much as I love the character to death, um, I think that there is a little bit of burnout. And the other thing that I have been kind of more aware of, oh, and the 90s series as well, the cartoon series, I think is great.
Yeah.
But the thing that I am also starting to become more conscientious of when I'm watching Batman movies is the mental health factor of the
Sure.
character,
Yeah.
and how that is one integral, but also there is something about that I think we can discuss on the spoiler episode a little bit more in terms of our conversation there, but the way that Batman suffers with mental illness and also is kind of giving into his psychosis in a way that a lot of other people can't, and Joker clumsily tried to kind of get at that, even though
Yeah,
I think it failed. But this does that a little bit, and I think it doesn't really kind of dive deep enough either. But Batman's always been a character where it's like, again, like you have a guy who is able to sustain this lifestyle, this world he's created, not the fancy aspect of it, but like the truly like going out at night and beating people up, because he has the finances and he's being enabled by the one person in his life that's closest to him, and he's still someone who is truly suffering, and not everybody can has the access and ability to do whatever they want or get whatever
sure.
they want, or what have you. So there is a weirdness there, I think, that I've become more a little bit. It's just, again, with mental health and wellness kind of being something that's becoming less and less of a stigma in this day and age.
Absolutely, yeah.
It is a weird juxtaposition in a lot of
Yeah, and it's
ways.
such a huge part of the character, right? And
Yeah.
then like I don't know if anyone's tackled it in a great way. It's just like Bat the character kind of gets a pass to kind of avoid all that stuff because that's just always how the character has been, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes they try to tackle that in different ways, and I maybe this trilogy will. I don't know if we got a ton of that here, but yeah, we can talk about that in the spoiler cast. But ultimately, I think it is, again, I go back to it, like each Batman version I think is interesting or valid in its own ways. I really, really enjoyed this. I can't wait to see it again. I'm gonna give it a 4.5 out of 5.
I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. And I think the other thing that we need to talk about a little bit in the spoiler review, and I'll just mention it here, is how this movie also uses social media and has an online presence throughout the entire movie, obviously with the Riddler, but how that modernization with the kind of classic undescript New York-esque looking city that is Gotham is kind of used. And I think that like the social media aspect of it is an important element throughout this film. And also it's just interesting to see how, again, a modern movie is using it in a way that kind of feels like, okay, I would be fascinated to look back at this movie in 10 years from now and see
If it
how it's
holds up
dated.
because of it,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that is interesting when you bring in modern elements like that that are very much of that time. I mean, each bat, like again, yeah, yeah,
Because a lot of
yeah,
because a lot of the Batman movies before this, like you look at Batman 89, yeah, Michael Keaton has a perm haircut, but it
sure,
it, it does feel timeless, with maybe the exception of the Prince, soundtrack, which is
sure.
great. I love it, but like that does feel like, oh, it's from the 80s. And then even with the Nolan movies, they have more tech and gadgets and stuff like that, but the tech and gadgets do kind of
Are kind
feel
of, they're
almost
Batman
Bond-like.
gadgets.
They're
Yes,
Bond-like,
exactly.
right?
Which means like it's not something I actually use, which means it can be timeless because it was this thing created for this guy, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like Iron Man in the first Iron Man when he uses the fucking Blackberry or whatever, you're like, oh, no one uses
Yeah,
those
yeah,
anymore.
exactly. And with this, like I could see like certain things that are used throughout
Palm
the
Pilot or whatever.
film in the Batman kind of being dated in and maybe a few years time, just in terms of technology, but also how the technology is used and how it's also kind of playing into certain politics of what's going on in the last, especially in the US in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. Well, guys, if you want more, you guys can check out our spoiler cast of the Batman, where there's a lot to tackle. That I know we did an hour, but there's a lot to tackle that we haven't even talked about. A lot of stuff in the final act, certain things that I just don't even want to say here. But like, you guys should really check that out when you see the movie. If you're listening to this beforehand, or if you've already seen the movie and you're listening to this first, go over there, check out our spoiler cast. Eric and I will probably talk for another hour or more about the Batman Thank you all for listening or watching. Hope you guys enjoyed us. Let us know what you guys thought of The Batman. You guys can tweet at us at Untitled_movies, but the easiest spot, one-stop shop, just go over to Letterboxd, Untitled_movies. We have other stuff that we would love for you guys to check out too. You guys can check out our review for Turning Red, the new Pixar movie, if you want a little CanCon.
A little.
A lot of CanCon, probably the biggest CanCon we've probably ever gotten, at least in a mainstream.
This CanCon will cover Pixar for the next 10 years.
I know. They never have to put another Canadian thing in anything. So go check out our review of Turning Red, as well as our review for No Exit. And we have a bunch of other stuff. Just search for Untitled Movie Podcast and Untitled Movie Reviews on YouTube or podcast services. As always, I am the Matt Man, and you can follow me on all social medias at Matt Rohrbeck and watch my stuff around the internet and on Family Feud Canada coming up and yada, yada, yada.
Oh, and you were also on Screencast recently.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, Eric. I was on the most recent episode of the Kind of Funny Screencast where we talk about kind of what we've been watching this year in 2022. So we talk about Murderville, The After Party, Pam and Tommy, Yellow Jackets. I bring up Last One Laughing Canada, some more CanCon. A lot of CanCon actually we talked about. So go check that out over on the Kind of Funny YouTube channel or on podcast services. Just search for Kind of Funny Screencast. Thank you, Eric.
And I am the Marchin Mite. You can find more of my video reviews on rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
Goodbye.
I'm Batman.